Today, I want to talk about the film Charisma by Kurosawa Kiyoshi, and I'm going to go into a decent amount of detail. So while I will mark spots for the most explicit spoilers, you should be warned. So Charisma is a film by Kurosawa Kiyoshi, who, by the way, has no relation to the more famous Kurosawa Akira. The kanji of their last names are different. And while it stands on its own as a particularly interesting work, it's also emblematic of everything great about Kurosawa Kiyoshi's style and artistic vision. So how do we describe Kurosawa Kiyoshi as a director? Well, a lot of cinephiles have a bad habit of reverting to comparing everything slightly quote-unquote weird to David Lynch. But I would actually say that a better comparison point for Kurosawa Kiyoshi is David Cronenberg. Like Cronenberg, Kurosawa Kiyoshi primarily works in the skeletal frameworks of genre pictures. Much of the details of his stories seem to have familiar beats and points from science fiction or horror traditions, those kind of archetypal genres. But like Cronenberg, Kurosawa seems to intentionally use these kind of almost cliche frameworks as areas to experiment and really get under our skin in much more unusual and unorthodox ways. This comparison is not perfect, of course. Kurosawa's films lack Cronenberg's penchant for body horror and are generally much quieter and more still in terms of atmosphere. And maybe not as explicitly horror in all ways. There's also perhaps more of a persistent interest in nature than in Cronenberg, although like Cronenberg, technology is still a major theme. So while it would be a mistake to go so far as to call Kurosawa a Japanese Cronenberg, I think a comparison to the Canadian director is in fact a good point to open up a discussion of this film, Charisma, and to learn to appreciate it with. So Kurosawa Kiyoshi has addressed the framework of ghost stories in his film Pulse, psychological crime thrillers in Cure, and family dramas in Tokyo Sonata, to name a few. Of course, these descriptions are laughably simplistic for what goes on in each of these films. These are frameworks that are toyed with in quite original ways, and Charisma seems to do something similar for the eco-horror genre, because its story is primarily about humanity and the possibility of discovering the uncanny in the natural world. The film is a remarkable evocation of many issues related to population ethics, to our duty towards nature, and to our broader spiritual role as animals, among others. But enough preamble. Here I'll give an outline of what Charisma is actually about. And again, I'll mark out a specific section for spoilers in the second half or so of the film where things get really interesting. For that reason, I don't think your experience of it will be negatively impacted if you listen to the section that isn't marked by spoilers, but if you're the type who likes to go in knowing as little as possible, please just do so now. The protagonist of Charisma is Yabuike, a veteran detective who is called in for the most important job of his life, negotiating with a criminal who has kidnapped a member of parliament and is holding him at gunpoint as a hostage. Yabuike and the captor have an intense stare-down while police wait outside with guns in case things get ugly. The captor silently passes a ransom note with his demand on it to Yabuike: restore the rules of the world. Yabuike then has a chance to shoot the captor and free the MP, but he hesitates and makes a tactical error. The captor instead is able to shoot the MP and kills him, but is then shot and killed by the police in turn. Yabuike explains that he hesitated because he felt that there must have been a way to save both the captor and his hostage. Instead, they both ended up dead.
両方を助けようと思っただけです。頭のおかしい男を助けてどうする？両方が助かるべきだとあの時は思いました。なんで？ うまく言えません。
それが世界の法則か。
Yabuike is suspended in disgrace. He's driven out of Tokyo by a higher-up and is dumped on the side of the road in the middle of a forest in rural Yamanashi Prefecture. It's a little ambiguous if this is his own will, something he wanted, or a kind of mafia-style punishment. In any case, it's here that the main focal point of the plot emerges, an unusual tree in the middle of a clearing. The tree is being kept watch over by a creepy, somewhat off-putting and suspicious man named Kiriyama. Kiriyama is living in an abandoned sanatorium in the forest. Apparently, this tree, in the center of the clearing, was planted by the former owner of the sanatorium, who has now passed, and who Kiriyama dearly misses. The tree appears to be in a weak state and needs a lot of maintenance from Kiriyama. But in spite of its feeble appearance, the tree is oddly beguiling. Kiriyama has come to nickname this tree Charisma, or Charisma, because of this mysterious power. But things are not all so cheery. Yabuike learns that Kiriyama's menacing nature comes from his need to be on constant vigilance over Charisma. There are forces around him who want nothing more than to remove Charisma from the forest. But why? The answer comes when Yabuike meets Kiriyama's main rival, a scientist and ecologist who operates a lab and research station in the same forest named Jinbo. She explains that Charisma as a tree is alone in the clearing for a reason. The tree's roots are exuding a toxin which is slowly poisoning all the other trees around it. All the trees around Charisma have withered. Charisma might appear weak, but looks can be deceiving. It's actually an apex predator destroying all the other trees around it. Jinbo hypothesizes that if Charisma is left alone, it will eventually destroy the entire forest. However, something is very unusual about this state of affairs. Normally, in response to such a threat, trees will evolve a defense mechanism and attempt to move away from it over generations. But the opposite is happening. All the trees in the forest are actually moving towards Charisma, seemingly intentionally throwing themselves off the metaphorical cliff. It seems that all the trees are just as charmed by Charisma as Kiriyama is, even at the cost of their own lives. There are other forces at work against Kiriyama as well. Though not officially allied with Jinbo, a private militia has formed which seeks to remove Charisma for the sake of making the lives of forest workers tasked with cleaning up all the dying trees easier. And there are also those who wish to uproot Charisma in order to sell it to a wealthy collector, who's interested in its rarity and seeks to study its unusual properties in a safer environment. Such is the position that Yabuike is thrown into, and the failed negotiator now has this new situation to act as a mediator in. He must mediate between Kiriyama, who wants to save Charisma at the expense of the forest, and Jinbo and the others who want to save the forest at the expense of Charisma. And once more, Yabuike hesitates because he has the same instinct.
両方とも生かす方法はないんでしょうか。
両方？
森もカリスマも両方です。
無理ですね。ありません。
It becomes all too obvious at this point that Charisma and the trees are somehow an analogy for humans, but the exact message or point of this analogy is harder to grasp than it might seem at first glance. As an immediate gut reaction, Yabuike's hesitation might seem hard to understand. When it comes to saving a single tree versus an entire ecosystem, how could we possibly choose the single tree, no matter how charming it was? But Yabuike visits Kiriyama again after hearing the appeal from Jinbo, and Kiriyama states the following in one of the more important scenes of the film.
おい、神保に何教育された？森全体のことを考えるあの木は化け物だ。そんなとこか。違うな。全然違う。それは人間が勝手に考えた理屈だろ。森は戦場だ。いろんな植物が生きたり死んだりしてる。もしカリスマが一本だけ残って他の木が全部枯れたとしても、それが法則なら仕方ないことだろ。強い者が勝つ。それがここの法則だ。俺はそういう方が好きだよ。 森全体を救ってどうする？人間の役に立つのか？のんびり山歩きでもするのか？なんだよそれは。みんな結局人間のことしか考えてない。勝手なんだよ。むちゃくちゃなんだよ。
While Kiriyama appears cold and brutal, he does have a point. Jinbo wants to save the forest. But for whom? For humans' own sense of beauty. To Kiriyama, it seems as though she essentially views the forest as her personal garden. He finds this a kind of ecological imperialism which is deeply distasteful. And from what does she seek to save it? From the forces of nature itself. She seeks to guard it from just the thing she claims to be preserving, the natural world. The natural world is not a place of constant serenity and tranquility. To turn it into that is itself a betrayal of everything natural. But then, Kiriyama ends the monologue with a chilling echo.
俺の目的は森の法則を回復させることだ。それは多分世界の法則かもしれない。
At this point, it's worth explicitly spelling out what I see as the problem of population ethics that charisma sets up the tree and the forest as a metaphor for, at least on some level. Philosopher of ethics Derek Parfit has put forward this issue under the name of the mere addition paradox in his text Reasons and Persons, and the problem is easiest to understand with illustrations. Let's say that there is a world with 1,000 people in it only, and those 1,000 people are represented by this group A, all of whom are extremely happy. They live in a state of bliss that none of us could imagine. They spend all day long doing whatever your favorite thing is, for the sake of this exercise. We'll call this World 1. What would happen if we added another group of 1,000 people, Group B, all of whom are also happy, but not nearly as happy as A? The 1,000 people in B are certainly quite happy. They are living lives that most of us would be envious of, but they aren't at the same level of absolute bliss as the people in A. We'll call this World 2. Would World 2 be a better or a worse world than World 1? An intuitive answer would be that it is a better world, as there is an overall larger amount of happiness in it. The total area covered by all the squares and the amounts of, rectangles and amount of happiness here is larger. It's not evenly distributed, but there is still a greater total amount of happiness. However, an even better world would appear to be World 3, where the Group A has a slightly lower level of happiness, but still a level far above the average person on Earth today. And all the people in Group B have the same level of happiness, so things are fairly distributed. World 3, then, has both the greatest total amount of happiness and the highest average level of happiness per person out of those three choices. World 1 has only 1,000 people in it, all of whom are unimaginably, impossibly happy. World 2 has 2,000 people in it, half of whom are unimaginably happy, and half of whom are just normally happy. World 3 has 2,000 people, all of whom have a level of happiness which is far above the earthly average, but doesn't quite have the same superhuman highs as World 1. And so far, it seems reasonable to choose 3. But things get more concerning when we also consider World 4. Here we have the 2,000 very happy people of World 3, A and B, but also another 1,000 people, C, all of whom are just sort of happy. Their lives are just average and okay. Nothing too special, but they could be worse. If we continue with our assumptions, this world would be another improvement, as overall there is still a greater amount of happiness in it. And now you can predict the next procedure. World 4 can be made even better with World 5, which again slightly reduces the highest highs of happiness, but increases both the overall amount of happiness and the average amount of happiness that everyone experiences. And perhaps now you can see the endpoint of this way of thinking. With these seemingly common sense presumptions, the best world possible would be one with an unimaginably large number of people all living lives that have a very small amount of happiness. We would have trillions upon trillions of people, if not more, but all of them would have lives that are just barely worth living. As long as the number of people is great enough, there would still be an overall greater amount of happiness in World X than there is in any of the worlds we've sketched out above. And Derek Parfit famously called this the repugnant conclusion of the argument, as it seems like something has obviously gone wrong. But it is very hard to argue what that something is when World X exceeds all others, both in terms of total happiness and the average distribution of it. And perhaps now we can understand Kiriyama's point a bit more. Parfit argued in terms of happiness here, but in the case of charisma, it might be better to think of it in the more broad philosophical sense of eudaimonia. While trees probably can't experience anything like we would call happiness, they can be marvelous and charismatic for sure. They can be excellent in their own way as trees. And this is Kiriyama's conclusion. With Jinbo's intervention, the forest will become a collection of extremely unremarkable average trees that do not stand apart from each other. Charisma has managed to raise itself above all other trees. The trees themselves willingly draw near it, sacrificing themselves in recognition of its brilliance. Kiriyama says, "May charisma shine forth in its brilliance. May there be a tree so marvelous that it is worth sacrificing the entire forest for." Parfit's happiness tables can look a bit abstract, but the metaphor of the trees does help bring the human element of this into view. We can think about all the great flourishing that has been accomplished by humans over the course of human civilization. Name whatever great example of human flourishing you want. Homer's Iliad, the philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, the plays of Shakespeare, the symphonies of Bach, vaccines, the internet, the sequencing of the human genome, the missing Pantsu episode of Strike Witches. It exists in virtue of some level of inequality. Those who had the time to devote to the making of such offerings to the temple of human flourishing did so because they had the time to spend to do so. They didn't have to dig rare earth metals out of hellish mines in the Congo and screw them in for 12 hours a day in a Chinese sweatshop. But what is the alternative? To forego everything higher? Even if some of those inventions we get could very much help alleviate the very miserable conditions that led to their creation? I speak here in terms of material resources, but we can think of this inequality as being distributed and broadened and flattened out in different ways. Maybe it's the amount of happiness people have, the amount of material resources they have. Maybe it's how much we spend in our duties to certain people versus others. We're torn by a push and pull to want to flatten and average and equalize, but also to be different and stand out. And it is worth remembering that this film is Japanese, and that traditional Japanese society is animist. Shinto beliefs teach us that there are spirits in all objects, and one of the most commonly deified natural objects is a tree. Tree worship is ancient in Japan, but even in these cases there is a hierarchy. All trees have spirits, but not all trees' spirits are marvelous enough to get roped with a shimenawa and have a shrine erected around them. I bring this idea up because the idea of a tree being marvelous is by no means something merely eccentric here. We could in fact argue that Kiriyama has a deeply Shintoist spirit, and that he's looked to the natural world and discovered something truly spiritually resonant, when mere scientists like Jinbo have merely looked at the forest as something to be toyed with, a kind of garden for us to keep as a plaything. To use the phrasing of Heidegger, Jinbo looks at the forest as standing reserve, but Kiriyama is still open to its revealing as poiesis. Yabuike has some sympathies for both Kiriyama and Jinbo, but he reluctantly continues to help Kiriyama safeguard charisma and prevent it from being felled. Of course, he doesn't do so because he's gone to the extreme of Kiriyama. He doesn't want the forest to be sacrificed. His answer is the same as the hostage situation. There must be a way to save both. It seems hopelessly naive, and is mocked by both Kiriyama and Jinbo. And yet it seems that it is the only correct answer. Even when it seems impossible or contradictory, we have to try to save both the individual and society at large. We have to have both freedom and harmony. We have to save both charisma and the forest. Now I'll get into spoilers about the ending of the film. A dizzying series of twists and turns occur over the fate of the tree, ultimately leading to its strange and very ominous ending. Eventually, Charisma is successfully uprooted and captured by the militia after they take Yabuike and Kiriyama by surprise. The militia ties Charisma to the top of their car and makes a getaway. But Kiriyama and Yabuike have thought ahead. The two block the road with a large log, and, when the militia are busy trying to remove the log, Yabuike ambushes them from afar and scares them off with gunshots. Kiriyama then hijacks their car and drives Charisma back to the clearing. However, Jinbo and her younger sister Mitsuko then reverse ambush Kiriyama, bash him over the head with a shovel, and set fire to Charisma while he's unconscious, leaving its fate seemingly sealed. For a moment, it seems as though the goal of saving both is as good as gone. Charisma has been sacrificed, and the forest will live. But things are not so simple. The following day, a new tree has emerged in Charisma's place. It is also a dying tree that seems to be collapsing in on itself, but it is massive with the circumference of an old redwood. It is not at all the unassuming little tree that Charisma was. Kiriyama is disaffected and doesn't feel the same attachment towards this new tree, Charisma 2.0, we'll call it. The tree he cared about most, Charisma, is now gone. But Yabuike takes his place and becomes obsessively attached to preserving and safeguarding Charisma 2.0 instead. Jinbo's younger sister Mitsuko is upset with Yabuike's strange obsession with the tree. She seems to have something of a crush on him and is upset at his constant liaisons with Kiriyama. When she lashes out at the tree and feebly attempts to destroy it with a rock, Yabuike pushes her away and then summarizes his view of the situation.
君は特別な一本の木と森全体とどちらかしか生き残れないとしたらどっちを選ぶ？これはとても難しい問題だ。でも最初から結局答えは一つだった。両方が生き残るしか道はない。生きる力と殺す力は同じものだ。これは君の姉さんが教えてくれた。さあどうしよう。片方が生きればもう片方は死ぬ。両方が生きようとすれば下手をすると両方が死ぬ。答えはない。というよりそもそもこういうことを問題にする方がおかしかったんだ。両方が生きようとしてるんだから両方が生きればいい。それがあるがままということだろう。もちろん両方が殺し合えば全滅する。それもあるがままだ。でもそれじゃあ世界がむちゃくちゃになってしまう。それを避けるために法則や軍隊が必要だと桐山君はそう言った。僕もついこの間まで何の疑いもなくそういう仕事の真っ只中にいた。でもやっと分かった。僕はあるがままの平凡な人間でいい。それで十分だ。特別な木なんて一本もなかったし森全体というものもなかった。ただあっちこっちに平凡な木が一本ずつ生えてる。それだけだ。
じゃあ藪池さんのやってることは何なんですか？
生かしてみたり殺してみたりあるがままにだ。
私には理解できません。
You might have noticed that while Yabuike was speaking, one tree tipped over in the background. It seems that Charisma 2.0 is starting to wreak its effect on the trees around it, just like its predecessor. The old battle over the tree reappears, with Yabuike in the role of safeguarding Charisma 2.0 instead of Kiriyama. Charisma 2.0 is still valuable enough that the collectors return and offer Yabuike 10 million yen for it. He says that they can do as they wish to the tree and he will not try to stop them, but that he doesn't need the money. Jinbo then comes to the clearing with explosives, and Yabuike doesn't try to stop her either, allowing her to blow the tree up. After helping her destroy the tree, Yabuike says the following.
多分これからが始まりです。
He then walks over to the remains of Charisma and sees a sprout in the middle of the tree's dead remains that indicates it is still connected to the ground and still has the possibility of renewal. One of the collectors then returns and holds a knife to Jimbo's throat, demanding that Yabuike hand him the sprout so that he can still sell it and make a profit. Yabuike is confronted with the same situation as the beginning of the film, a captor and a hostage, and here he finally accomplishes what he wanted. He saves both. Namely, he shoots the captor so he will be wounded but not fatally, and he wraps up the wounded captor and begins to carry him to the nearest town to get him to a hospital. The final scene, however, shows Yabuike on the edge of the city with the wounded captor. He pulls out a cell phone, answers it, and the following exchange takes place.
あ、部長。
ヤブイケか。お前何やったんだ。
今から戻ります。
The last shot of the film shows the city in the distance completely engulfed in flames. We see helicopters flying overhead and hear sirens, gunshots, and the sounds of destruction. I love this ending because of how strange and unexpected it is, and I can't possibly give the only possible interpretation. But this is what I personally take from the film. Yabuike has achieved what is called Wu Wei in the Taoist tradition. He learned that the whole choice of whether to save Charisma or the forest wasn't really his to make, but it was his to help be accomplished. The hardest possible thing we can do in times of extreme crisis, especially ecological ones, is to let go and embody our trust in the natural world. And there is perhaps no profession more antithetical to this than Yabuike's, a policeman, the symbol of exerting law and order over the chaos of society. But that is precisely what Yabuike does. He doesn't become apathetic, of course. He works with people and does what he thinks is right. But he learns to do so in a way that is natural and not to force his will on the world. And in doing so, he manages to right his wrong from the beginning. He saves both against all odds. I take the very last scene to represent the whole world ending and collapsing in on itself in chaos, precisely because others have lost this ability to move and live with the natural world instead of trying to impose their will on it. Of course, that's not the only possible interpretation. One might interpret it as some kind of havoc wrought by leaving Charisma 2.0 alive instead, as the tree is technically still living, as if the toxins have spread to human civilization from the forest. Or by destroying it, perhaps humans have denied the emergence of a new god who is setting the stage for something greater than any of us could have imagined. I can't tell you what the film means, but I absolutely encourage you to watch it and think it over with me, because the film itself is truly as beguiling and marvelous a specimen as Charisma the Tree is. Thank you for listening.